Greetings, Last Spell folks. I wanted to take a second to go over the Over the Mist and Far Away patch notes, because this is a big patch and has added a lot of things to the game that I think are going to really transform the game. Some of which we've been playing with for a while on the beta branch, and others which are new to me as of my last playthrough. So without further ado, let's talk about the new changes in this version of the Last Spell, Over the Mist and Far Away. So first and foremost is the patch rework, and I'm going to talk about this through the examples that they provided. So this is our old perk screen in the lower right. We had 5 tiers, and if we're being honest, my experience was always I pretty much had my builds, and that was about the extent of it. So tier 1, I would often take Avid Learner, which eventually got moved, and, a few other things. And, for range characters, I would build slightly different, etc. They didn't like the roteness of the builds that people are coming up with, so they added a lot of randomness, and the new system is what I will show you here. So here are 2 characters, and to walk you through the way that the interface works, there are still 5 levels, and you still get perks at a certain rate, so that I believe around level 9 you get your first level 5 perk. But what's happening is each column is generated randomly from a collection that is associated with the banner at the top of that column. So moving left to right, you have the melee column, the caster column, the ranged column, and those are always fixed for every character. You'll always have those 3 columns, but the contents of those columns draw from a variety of perks. So as an example, the perk in the upper left of the left portrait there is Sprint, which allows you to sacrifice health in order to regain movement. And it won't always be Sprint. There are other abilities you can see on the second character. The upper left is Fatality, I believe. So you're going to have a random selection of 5 perks for melee, caster, and ranged. Then the next 2 columns are randomly generated from a selection. So the first character here has the poison column, and then what I refer to as the assassin column, whereas the second portrait here has the poison column and the defensive column. And then the last 3 columns are always what I'll call, for lack of a better description, I think they're kind of like the grab bag, but they're kind of utility slots. So some of them are potion related, inventory related. That's where cheer shows up. That's where some other ones that we'll talk about show up. But basically the idea is you'll get these 2 random columns, 3 utility columns, and the 3 core competency columns. The other ones not shown here is there is a debuff column, and I think we might see that in a future one here, so let's check. Yeah, so the blue one is for debuffs, and I think that's all of the ones that they've currently implemented. But the reason that they chose to design it this way, and I think this was a brilliant change, is it gives them more flexibility. They can expand the number of melee perks, the number of range perks, etc. They can also add whole new segments. They could create a Shadow Assassin one, or who knows what, it doesn't really matter, but they've created a huge amount of variance. And when you are creating a character, you need to think a lot about what is available to you. There are also some really fascinating builds that I haven't even gotten to try out yet, but there are at least 2 perks. One is called Flexibility, and the other is I don't remember the name of the other one, but they enable you and they encourage you to do a hybrid build, like a melee weapon and a ranged weapon. And by alternating attacking between them, you can get some pretty chunky benefits. So I think there's a lot of interesting design space. I've been playing with the perks update on the beta branch for, I guess, about a month now, and it breathed a ton of new life into the game. So I really love what they've done there. And then here are just a few more. At some point, I'd like to do a video where I go over all of the perks, but I haven't been able to get a comprehensive list. I should probably data mine it. But for now, you can just see there's a much, much more diverse set of options when building a character, and you need to think about them. Like, you don't want to pick to do like an assassin character who doesn't have the orange dagger tree, or you don't want to go for a melee tank character who doesn't have the defensive tree that, if I go back to it, was the gray hammer tree there. That's where back protection lives. I believe that's also where coagulation lives, and one of my favorite perks, which is human ballista, also lives there. So anyways, the perks changes are brilliant, and in their own words, they talk a bit about some of the issues that they had. First and foremost, this added flexibility for them, which I think is, a brilliant way to address the fact that they want to be able to keep adding content. And then secondly, they talk about making it feel more roguelite, which it absolutely does, encouraging players to experiment more and, creating more synergy. So overall, I think this is a wildly successful improvement to this particular system. Now, one of the things that they did as part of this is they also reworked existing perks. So they talk a little bit about the quality of perks themselves being heterogeneous, which, based on the games that I've played, there will always be some diversity, right? There's always going to be this quirk is generally better than this other perk types of problems. And the good news is they can pull back analytics and say, wow, this is never getting picked. We should buff it. This is getting picked all the time. Maybe we should take it down a notch and seek to make them more evenly balanced. But I generally think that that's a bit of a fool's errand. There are always going to be things that are going to be stronger. And the second thing that they hit on here is they didn't make it their aim to make them all exciting. I generally think that should be their aim. Make all of the perks interesting in their own right and try to create groupings of perks that, when put together, create interesting playstyles. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those as we move a bit further through. So this is one example of a overhauled ability. So fatality used to be you can kill an enemy if it's low on health that is next to you. Now that is also true, but it also scales based off of level. So at the highest level, you can kill monsters that have like 30 hit points. Still not a perk that I would ever take, but, it's interesting nonetheless. Now, new mechanics, this is where we're going to talk a bit about some interesting builds. They gave two examples here. One is Contagion, which I think is really, really cool, but I have not fully figured out how to use it. The short version of it is basically your debuffs will spread to adjacent things along with this Contagion debuff. And it happens when you debuff something that has already been debuffed. I use this a lot with poison builds where I spread poison and Contagion. There's a skill called Epidemic that every time you apply poison, you also apply Contagion. And then by further debuffing, you can get your poison to spread, and it can be very satisfying. I've not had great luck really making it pop off. At some point, I'm going to try to. The second one here, though, is the one that I am itching to get working, and that is blood magic. This is your standard like necromancer warlock type of thing, but basically your mana pool disappears and you start spending health at a 3x the mana cost range. So a 5 mana spell costs 15 health. It's just so cool. This coupled with vampirism, so that you're getting back some of your hit points, and you can just kind of like cast, and it's really cool. I think that there's huge upshot here, and it synergizes with a few other abilities. Like there's one called Organic Tank that increases your overall health pool. I want to make a biocaster tank work at some point in the future, but I love these changes. I love these new systems. Another thing they talk about is limiting randomness. There were a lot of like 5% chance perks like Swift as the Wind or Energized, and they found, I still found that they were useful, but they were hard to play around. And so the rightmost ability there, Legendary Assassin, is that part of their new design philosophy to push towards making it so that you can predict what you're going to do and what the result is going to be. So now it's every 3 isolated units killed, restore 1 action point. As a side note, this is a tier 5 on the dagger column, I believe, and it's a really awesome one. We'll talk more about isolated kills in a second because there's also a rework for that. But I think these changes are good because RNG isn't particularly fun. If you've watched some of my Darkest Dungeon content, that was one of the things that always felt particularly bad about the original Darkest Dungeon game was accuracy, meaning that sometimes you just missed. And Darkest Dungeon has largely moved away from that using blind tokens. But I digress in that regard. But I think generally speaking, for games of this nature that are like turn-based strategy games, it's a good idea to limit randomness as much as possible. So now you still may or may not get the kills, but you will know if there's a chance you're not going to get the kills, etc. So you can plan around it a bit more, be a bit more strategic. Giving better information on perks, again, this is brilliant. It's these small things that I think over time are going to make the last spell really sing as a game. But basically what they're talking about is the dividing line that you see in the coagulation tooltip there. Below that, it shows you at this moment how much benefit will you get from this particular perk. And that's hugely beneficial. And I've already watched it change the way that I play the game because now I understand how much benefit I'm getting from, say, Magic Fuel, I believe is the name of it, but basically it's how much mana you have turns into a flat damage bonus. And now I can see, oh, okay, with my current mana pool, it's 8% damage increase, which is much easier to weigh against other things than having to do the math in your head, etc. So more information on tooltips has been hugely beneficial. Also, this is a quick one, but now when something gives an ability, the ability shows up as part of the tooltip. Super handy, nice little flourishes. The HUD elements, these are huge, and I'll just switch over to show you the little animated GIF that they provided. But what they are talking about is if you look at the screen, there are a bunch of circles above the action bar, and these circles tell you your status in moving towards achieving certain perk thresholds and also what abilities will be active when you do a particular action. The example that I'll use for this is a perk called Third Eye, and I believe it's every third attack, every third hit ignores vision requirement, right? So you can like shoot through trees, etc. And what happens is every time you do an attack, you see a counter that is counting down to being able to use Third Eye, or is it counting up? Don't remember which. So you know when Third Eye will be active, and then when you use Third Eye, it gets circled so you know that you're using that action. It makes it much easier to know if you are activating certain skills, and it really added to the readability of the game. So this is super, super helpful. And with this, they also added any debuffs showing up. So it's strange that this screenshot doesn't show both, but any activated circles would also be present to the right of those debuffs. But very, very helpful. Lots more information in the HUD, hugely beneficial. So, new early game maps. I won't bore you with a ton of information about it, but basically what they said was the curve for learning how to play this game is not smooth yet. And it's, it's an early beta, so that's totally understandable. But they added 2 new maps with the purpose of making things more learnable and readable. So then they show this picture, which is just the new end screen, which I'll talk about for like 2 seconds here. The new end screen is part of a shift in the way that they're telling the story of the game. So previously, the story of the game was like you prevent the apocalypse, you're trying to banish magic, etc. Now each town has its own rune, and you're trying to crack each spell at each rune at each location, and there's a whole meta narrative that's going to be coming along with it. But it's cool. And what they did was they added 2 new introductory maps. The first is Swamp Fert, which I have not actually played, but basically it's a corridor. Enemies can only attack from 2 sides. It's very small. It has a bridge, so it's very much about learning how to play, and it's only 1 night of play. It looks like this. You can see there's not a lot to it. Some bad guys are going to come in. You're going to learn how to whack the bad guys around, etc. Nothing groundbreaking there. I haven't actually played Swamp Fert because you have to start a new game in order to get access to that. Guildenberg, on the other hand, I have played through twice on Apocalypse 4 and Apocalypse 5. Spoiler alert, I won both those runs, but it is designed to be an easier introduction before you get to Lakeburg. And the way that they did that, if I bring up the image here, is one side is basically not, is basically mountain, right? So you're only going to be attacked from the top right, the bottom right, and the lower left. There's also some interesting cliffs that split this up, and it's a really interesting map. It's got some fun flavor with the mine carts and the minecart rails, and generally also has a smaller diversity of enemies. You're not going to see a lot of the crazy enemies that Lakeburg starts to roll out, or the ones that end up in Glenwald, so it's more approachable. And I think that it's a really fun map to kind of get started with. My only complaint is I feel like it needs a unique ending. I think every map should have some unique, like, final enemy or way in which it is unique. For Glenwald, I think it's okay that it's just like you get surrounded completely. And for Lakeburg, we have the druids. I think it would have been fun if there was something to do with the mine shaft or the mine carts or those types of things. The other thing that this made me think about that I think could be really interesting moving forward, and we're way off patch notes right now, but at some point in the future, I think they could do like a moving spell where you're like in a corridor and you have to like escort. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. Guildenberg is quite interesting and a great introduction. It is definitely easier than the other 2 maps, Lakeburg and Glenwald. As is proof by the fact that I got my first Apocalypse 5 victory on it. But still a very fun map, really interesting. Next big change is the rework to opportunistic and isolated. And I think this is, again, moving in a beautiful direction. The change was basically that isolation and opportunism are always active. So if I pick up 10% isolation, I will do 10% more damage to isolated enemies with any skill. Same with opportunism. Opportunism is a modifier if an enemy is debuffed. So if the enemy is poisoned and I have 10% opportunism or 110% opportunism, then I will hit for 110 damage. There are then certain weapons, like the longbow, that have a 2x multiplier on isolation, which would mean that if you are doing 110 with the longbow, your isolation will do 210. But this is really cool because it means that you can kind of do an isolation build without being limited to a very small number of weapons. So here is an example of a weapon that does not have an isolation effect, which is the crossbow, and its straight shot does 92 to 102, and then it has an isolation modifier that looks like it's probably 10%, 18 to 20. So you get the isolation bonus even though this item does not have isolation on it per se. Whereas if we look at this particular skill, Crush, it has opportunism at 2x. So you have 10% opportunism, but it multiplies that by 2, so you get 220. So you're getting some really chunky opportunism attacks. So I think these reworks are really great because they add flexibility to isolation and opportunism that they previously didn't have. They were previously kind of niche. One last example here. Here's the Crush actually happening and, you know, hitting like a truck. Last but not least, and I think this is pretty minor in my book, I haven't really played with them much, but traps have become first-class defensive structures, which means that now they can be repaired and when you build them, they cost a little bit more materials up front, and then you can repair them to replenish their charges. I think traps still aren't in a good place, but I need to play with them a bit more. And their reasoning here for why they changed them to be this way is originally they wanted them to feel disposable, and then later on they decided that it didn't make sense to have to tear something down and then rebuild it in order to get back its charges. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So that is all of the changes. So my thoughts, just 30-second brief spiel. I think that this patch has been hugely beneficial to the replayability and the fun of the last spell, mostly thanks to the perks overhaul. There's also been a lot of polish done. The new map, I think, is not going to add a ton of interest because I think it is a step down, and, you know, the other changes that I didn't even mention when we were talking about this is they changed the meta progression a bit. I still think the meta progression is a bit broken in the game because you're sort of like forced into a bunch of losses until you pick up those really high priority meta progression extra action points. But overall, I think the game is in a really good place. I think the perks update added huge replayability just through the diversity of being able to look at characters. I still think my number one feature request, and I'll link in the description if I remember to my bug that I filed with Ishtar about this. I think that at the beginning of the game, you should be able to draft your heroes from a pool of heroes. And the reason that I say that is because I think the first night lacks agency. You get 3 random heroes, they have garbage weapons, it doesn't feel good. If instead they gave you 9 heroes and you could look at them and then draft 3, I think it would be much more interesting. It would give you some diversity of play. You could be like, I'm going all melee heroes, I'm going all casters. So I think that that would really improve the early game. But overall, still really enjoying the last spell. If you are also enjoying the last spell, I'd love to hear from you, and feel free to swing by. I play the last spell every Tuesday night live, and there are videos that go live every day of my playing of the last spell. So for now, thank you for watching. Hope you found this patch notes useful or interesting, and I hope to see you around on a stream or in the comments. But for now, have a good one. Bye-bye.